Hello and welcome to Spring Office Hours, Season 3, Episode 17, Spring Security Architecture Principles. My name is Dan Vega. I'm a Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom, and I am joined by a special guest today, Danielle Garnier-Moiroux. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. Good to be on again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. It's been a while since we talked. I was talking to you before the show. You've been a busy man traveling the speaking circuit, doing your thing. So yeah, it's good to catch up. And that is actually what we're talking about today. We are going to preview your talk that is upcoming at Spring I/O. So before we get into that, though, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Daniel. I am part of the Spring and Tanzu teams at Broadcom now. In the Spring team, I contribute to the umbrella of Spring Security project. So Spring Security proper, but also Spring Authorization Server. And in the Tanzu portfolio, I do applied Spring Security. So I build the single sign-on solution for the Tanzu application platform. Take
Nice.
these frameworks and build something real with it that we ship to customers.
That's awesome. Coincidentally, last week I had on another Dan Dobrin from Google, and now Dan from Broadcom. And man, the Dans are taking over this show. I think we need to
Right?
keep
Yeah,
this
you have a
going.
long string of Dans all the way through until
Yeah,
Spring IO.
yeah, that'd be awesome. So DaShuan is out today. He is doing his thing, traveling, talking to customers. So it's nice that we get to sit down and just talk about Spring Security, because I know that is one of the questions that comes up more than any other question. So I do a lot of content on everything Spring. And even when I'm not talking about Spring Security, somebody finds a way to ask me a question about security.
Right.
So I guess what I'm getting at here is, I know we have a lot of people in the live stream. So if you are here and you have questions on Spring Security, let's go ahead and ask those. I'll go ahead and star those if we get back to them a little bit later, but get those questions in now so we can talk about them. And with that, we do this live stream usually every Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I wanted to accommodate our friend today, so we're a little bit earlier, but then we will turn this into a podcast. So you can go ahead and catch this, get this podcast wherever you get your podcast from. So I want to start here. I want to go ahead and let me click us over to this maybe. Yes. So I want to start here. We're talking about Spring I/O. I wanted to get a few speakers on that are going to be speaking at the conference as we lead up to the conference at the end of May, which we were just talking about is right around the corner. May came out of nowhere, and now we're 3 weeks away from the conference, or 4 weeks away from the conference. So that's pretty crazy. I'm excited about that. This is kind of in your neck of the woods. Where are you at? Are you in France?
I am in Paris, France.
Oh,
So
nice.
Barcelona is, by American standards, is next door. European standards, a little bit further south, right? You can
Yep.
go by train. It's about 6-7 hours, something like that.
How will you get there? Do you take the train or do you fly, or
No,
do you
I'm going to fly for that one. I try and avoid flying, but
Yep.
taking a full day for a trip for a conference that's going to be quite a few days.
Yep.
I still want to spend some family time during the
Yep.
week, so I'm
For
taking the
sure.
shortcut. I'm flying there.
That's good. That's good. Now I have never been to a Spring I/O before. This is my first one that I'm going to this year. I'm really excited about it. I'm not only going to be there, but I'm going to be speaking. And I was lucky enough to be in Barcelona in November for VMware Explore Barcelona. So that was my first time in Barcelona. Beautiful city. It was a little cold there in November though. So I'm looking forward to being there in May.
Yeah,
What
that should be
what's the weather
gorgeous.
like? Is it pretty
Yeah.
good right now?
Well, Paris was still a bit further north, so
Okay.
still spring is coming. Spring is arriving. But in Barcelona, it should be a bit hotter than this, and usually in May the weather is really gorgeous
Nice. Oh, I cannot
and
wait.
not too hot because it can get hot in the summer.
In the summer. Yep, that's what I heard. All right. So if you go on the Spring IO site, and then there's a way to look at all the confirmed sessions. So if you go down and you find Spring Security Architecture Principles, we can click on that and click on that. So for those of you at home listening to us on the go, springio.net will get you to the latest version of this website. So I wanted to start with your abstract, Daniel. I really love this. As someone who has to like write abstracts all the time, I pay a little bit more attention to abstracts. Some
More
people
than
get it.
attendees.
Yes, more than attendees. And I really enjoyed this abstract. And so I want to break it down because I think it will kind of lead us into what you're going to be talking about at Spring IO. So when you need to secure your application, you use Spring Security. It's the de facto standard. It's robust, extensible, and brings sensible defaults to your application. So I want to start there. Sensible defaults. I think that's like one of the biggest things that it brings. It locks everything down for you. And I think this is a really good approach. I don't know if every security framework out there follows this, but they should, because it seems like the right move, right?
Well, yeah, in terms of security, you can't do something halfway, right? And if you're doing, I don't know, if you're doing databases and you do an ORM, and then by default you're going to do n+1 queries. Maybe that's not a big deal when you start, right? You're going to have performance problems in the future. But with security, you can't really leave the door open by default, because it only takes one attacker, one motivated individual to, cause severe loss to your business, basically.
Right.
And so Spring Security tries to bring you the defaults of locking things down, but also giving you, the first tools for opening gradually your application without having to understand all of it,
Yeah.
right? So if your identity provider is usually, I don't know, if it's Azure, then it gives you a very simple way to hook into that without thinking too much about it, by hiding some of the complexity of the things you can configure and do that for you.
Right. Um, Spring, you mentioned that Spring Security is the de facto standard. Uh, I cannot stress this enough. People, please do not try and write your own security framework. It is so confusing that even when you have a library as good as Spring Security is, it's still hard to use, right? Like that's how important it is to have, right? Like you can't get this wrong. Like this needs to be right. And
Absolutely.
so,
That's what we have in the FAQ too, right? There's somewhere in the Spring Security reference doc, we have this that says you need an understanding of the technologies you intend to use before you can successfully build applications with them, and
yep.
security is complicated.
Yes, very complicated. Um,
So we try
okay.
and encapsulate this, right? The
Yes.
knowledge and the
Yep.
the 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 correct use of these technologies for you, so that you don't have to understand all of it
Right.
before.
But you still need an understanding. Like you can use Spring Security has some great support for OAuth in there.
Right.
You still kind of need to understand the basics of OAuth, but Spring Security makes it easier to work with OAuth, right? Um, okay, I like this next part. It says, but newcomers can feel lost as soon as they step out of the getting started guides and need to fine tune their configuration for specific use cases. Developers can find themselves frantically copy pasting from Stack Overflow until it kind of sort of works. And man, that's a good one, because I think a lot of, I've done this before too with some of the Spring Security stuff. I copy and paste something from some blog post or Stack Overflow and put that in my code. It compiles, but I'm not sure exactly what it's doing, but it works, right? And so we see developers doing this a lot. Do you see like a lot of issues? I know you answer questions on like Stack Overflow and
Right.
on the Twitter sphere. Do you see a lot of questions coming up because of this? Because somebody just kind of pasted some code in and really doesn't understand how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the reflex. We all do this. I
Yeah.
started doing that, but when I started with Spring Security, I started doing this. I was a user before.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
contributed to this, and it was very confused as well. And it has great initial onboarding for adding
Hmm.
something, right? It has the guide for, oh, I want to, load my users from, like, have a list of users in a database.
Yep.
Fine. And there's the 15-minute guide that you have on spring.io, and you can do that perfect. But then as soon as your use case becomes a little bit more complicated, oh, now my users, they have a little bit of metadata around it, and then they also have, there's an external service that I need to touch to do some special permissions or something. Then suddenly it explodes in complexity. You don't really know what the entry point is for achieving that. And so
Hmm.
you go to Stack Overflow, and then you start copying some stuff. You do you have old comments from 2018 that tell you to do what the docs absolutely tell you not to do.
Yep. Yep.
And you try that, and worst case it completely, well, maybe best case it doesn't work, and like worst case it kind of opens your application too much,
Yep.
and then you
Yep.
have a security vulnerability in your app.
Yep. Um, it's funny because I think one of the first times that we talked, I kind of joined the company 2.5 years ago, and I was getting some questions around Spring Security and JWTs, and very similar. I went and looked for like an answer to my question, like using JWTs in Spring Security, right?
Right.
And I found the same example reproduced in blog form in 20 different videos of writing your own custom like JWT filter. And I said,
Right.
this is very like, there's a lot of steps to go through to do this. I don't think that there's got to be a better way. And so I pinged you on Slack, and you're like, that OAuth2 support is built into Spring Security. You could just
Right.
you do this. And I was like, there is a better way to do this. So yeah, it is. Try not to like go around and just copy and paste everything you see out there, because there might be a better way to do it. Check we tell people this all the time on the show. The most up-to-date place for this type of information is the documentation. The Spring documentation is great. That would be my first place. Don't ask ChatGPT, because that doesn't have access to the updated documentation. Start there first.
And we absolutely focus on the documentation. The security team, we don't write a lot of blog posts explaining how to do stuff,
Hmm.
because we try with some
Hmm.
success that when you Google something, it takes you to the reference doc first.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's good. That's really the best place to start. Spring Security only uses a handful of core building blocks, and they're present everywhere in a library. Knowing what those are, how they're meant to be used, and how to effectively leverage them will give you the keys you need to implement all of your custom needs. Can you talk at a high level what some of these building blocks are?
Yeah, sure. So basically, we're going to cover mostly servlet applications. So Spring MVC, because it's the lion's share of usage we have.
Yep.
But you kind of you're able to transpose that into the reactive world without too much of a hassle. The names may be slightly different, but basically, so Spring Security is mostly focused on securing your web application and your endpoints. Of course, you can do batch and integration and so on, but core of what we do is securing endpoints. And so we need to interact with HTTP traffic. And the way we do this in the servlet stack, so in Spring MVC, is through an interface called filter, which is used to be in Java EE. It's in the Jakarta package now, and it
Yep.
has this one method that takes the request object, it takes the response object, and then a filter chain, and it can read the request, make a security decision, and then potentially write to the response. If it needs to add context, if it needs to block the response because it looks like an attack, and then it can decide to do nothing and then delegate to the rest of the application, so the rest of the filters, by calling into this filter chain abstraction. And then at the very bottom, after all these security filters have been applied, we get to your controller method in your REST controller, regular controller. And so that's the core of interacting with HTTP. And you can do
Yep.
everything through here. That's the entry point for securing things. But that's very low level, if you will, because you're
Yep.
reading an HTTP request. You kind of have to understand where is the security stuff in there, and like, how do I parse a MTLS certificate or a TLS certificate? How do I
Hmm.
parse a login request? And when you think about it, it's, it's not core to the security domain when you're checking credentials, when you're checking authorization. And so
Hmm.
there's another layer on top of that, which is the authentication and the things that allow you to produce authentications. And so the authentication interface in Spring Security, it represents the logged in entity, or the entity that's making a request to your application. So it can be a human, it can be Daniel, but it can also be an automated robot account. It can be made, with a session cookie. It can be made with a token. And so Spring Security has a way in the filters that takes the, the low level, details, implementation details, and it transforms that into an authentication object, which represents an authentication request. Like, oh, I'm trying to log in. And then it has an authentication manager, which has a list of authentication providers. As a user, you implement authentication providers. They take these authentication requests and they turn them into successful authentications. So the
Hmm.
result of a successful authentication. And this is where you make your decision. So a very common use case that I like to show is when you start with Spring Security, you do form login. So, you have a form, a username, and a password, because it's easy, it's out of the box, you don't have to connect with anything.
Right.
And with this, you can write your own authentication provider that has custom rules for validating a password, for example. And if you do this, so maybe for a special user, and if you do this, anywhere that an app uses a username and a password to authenticate a request,
Hmm.
then we're just going to use that special logic to check the password.
Right.
Um, and so, if you're doing HTTP basic authentication and not form login, then we use that. We use this authentication provider. So as a user, you don't need to understand the HTTP layer, the parsing the messages. You just need to understand how to validate an authentication request and producing something that works.
Right. Okay. So along those same lines, I have a couple of questions that came in that I think we can kind of talk about because they're kind of related. So, on those building blocks, I have a question here that is, what's the difference between principal and user details? And details regarding context, which to be used would be appreciated.
Right. So, so the first part of the question, principal and user details.
Yep.
In First, we have to be very specific about what we mean by principal, because if you
Yes.
open this authentication interface, the first line is going to say it's a public interface authentication extends principal. And this principal lives in the Java security package. So it's the
Yep.
Java, the JDK's ID of a authenticated or of a user that's interacting with your application. Spring Security has a higher level detail or implementation that is the authentication object. So
Yep.
never ever go touch the lower level Java principal. What you want to
Right.
be working with is authentication. And this authentication interface, it has a get principal method that returns an object. And it also has a get granted authorities. And so these are the two interesting bits of what an authentication is. So it's who is this user? What's their identity? So what's my name? What's my birthday? What's my email? Or
Yep.
whatever is relevant to my application. And then the authorities is what is used to make authorization decisions. So, are you a user? Are you an admin? Do you work in finance? Do you have the scope to read messages? And so this allows Spring Security to it allows you to configure Spring Security to say only admins have access to the admin panel.
Hmm.
And so the principal is basically the identity, the authentication part of the authentication object without the authorization part.
Hmm.
In the case of a username password login, the principal is usually implemented as user details. So this is what you have in your database and that you load from your database to make, to show the name of your user in the banner. But if you're doing another kind of login, so for example, you're doing auth2, we're talking about auth2, and you log in with, Azure ID, Keycloak, Google, whatever. You don't get the authentication you have. The principle of that will be, for example, an auth2 user or an OIDC user if you're doing, OpenID Connect. And so it will have different properties than what a user detail has. So
Right.
user details is one of the implementations we use for principal.
Awesome. I think those are.
Yeah, and so the second part, maybe context, I think we mean here by that security context.
Yep.
And so the security context in Spring Security is the thread local per request object that we make, that we put the authentication in, basically, so that anywhere in your dependency tree, you can call security context holder, get context, get authentication, and you get the authentication without having it to pass it all the way down, which allows a lot of framework, niceties for
and in this particular case, we're never asking for the user details, right? We're always asking for the authentication object. Okay, so I have one more question here, kind of in regards to some of those things we were talking about. It's always always lost in security filters. I think the filters are a critical part of security. How to memorize them, i.e., the execution. Do you have them memorized? I mean,
no,
I
I don't.
You see them a lot. So,
I don't.
So if Daniel doesn't have them memorized, then you don't have to have them memorized.
So you don't have to have them memorized, but you need to find your way around them.
Yep.
So first place to look at is when you start a Spring Boot application where you have Spring Security enabled, you will have a log line that is usually the biggest, the longest one with the most characters in it. And it comes from default security filter chain. And it says, we'll secure such path or any request with, and it has a list of filters. And depending on your app, it has like 10 to 25 filters in them. And that's for seeing, the configuration, basically. So you could go into this default security filter chain class, put a breakpoint, and you'll see the list of filters that are loaded for a given application. But that's very static. And so if you want a more dynamic thing and you want to see execution and see, if you have something that explodes and you want to see where the bug is or where your filter chain is stuck, well, the magic trick for debugging security is setting the log levels for all of Spring Security to the trace level. So in your application properties, you're going to set logging.level.org.springframework.security, and you set that to trace. When you do this, when a request comes in, it's going to tell you securing such and such endpoint, and then invoking filter 1, web async manager, integration manager filter. Invoking the second filter, the disable URL encode filter, and so on. And so you'll see the list of filters that are invoked with some extra traces on them. And then, it will say, the coarse filter is like 3 out of 17.
Yeah.
And then you can read this, and then when you see it, it blows up at 14 out of 17, and then nothing happens after that. You can go and look into that one filter that that was the last one invoked.
Yeah, this is a tip you gave me like early on, and I don't know how anybody does Spring Security without it. You need to like see all of the things that are going on. And to that same level, again, I'm going to point to the documentation. There's a really good diagram in there of how like security filters work, all the different filters that are available. So definitely check out the documentation. But yeah, anytime I'm doing Spring Security, I always set the log level to trace because without it, you're kind of lost.
Yeah, which you may not want in production, but
exactly.
For debugging, it's a great tool.
Yep. Cool. Okay, I got another question here while we're here from our good friend Thomas. What do you think of Spring Security ACL? Well, we have a need for dynamic responsibilities. I don't even know that I know what ACL is. So this is the access control list.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have
exactly.
Before.
I've never used it myself.
Okay.
So there is something in there. We've been reworking the authorization model in Spring Security quite a lot in 6.0
Hmm.
and onwards.
Yep.
Trying to move to a little bit more of a Java functional configuration with
Yep.
access. What I see a lot of people doing now, when you have fine grained responsibilities that you want to check at runtime, I've been seeing people implementing centralized authorization. And so using projects such as OpenFGA, or what was the other one, the OPA, Open Policy Agent, and you delegate that and you write your rules in their own custom language, which we don't
Mm.
really provide. We don't have like a declarative way for you to provide these.
Yep.
And so you delegate to that using uh, you know access to like the any request dot access or such and such endpoint dot access, and then you pass along that calls into these services that are specialized to answer queries quickly. I think the ACLs is more of a it's been it's been in for quite a while, and it's not necessarily what I see that's most used.
Okay. Cool. Thanks for answering that. I have a couple more questions. I might as well get to them while we're here. I'm not sure on this one. How to do dynamic role access for menu management?
I
Um,
guess it touches what we've been talking on, right? So
yeah.
how how do we dynamically assign roles to
Hmm.
users so that they can see this or that? And so in the in menu management, it's very broad. Maybe it means showing some things and not showing others.
Yep.
Maybe it means blocking access. So for blocking access, we kind of covered it with the primitives we have with the access, the authorization manager now it's called. For showing certain things, it's kind of more difficult. So you'll be injecting the authentication object into your request handler and then making decisions with this.
Yep.
What we've got coming, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but in 6.3, we have a lot of improvements for authorization. And some of that is um, allowing um, the authorization to be fine-grained on the domain objects you produce. So if you load something from a repository and you want to say only the admins can see, the
Mm.
birthday of a customer, or only
Yep.
the admins can see the remaining inventory of such item.
Yep.
It used to be, you had to write that into your business logic. You had to
Yep.
pass the authentication object and do some sort of filtering. And so, or it's like some weird, post filtering that wasn't really designed for this. And so now we're moving towards a model where you can produce these domain objects and just annotate some fields and say,
Ooh.
ooh, this, we mentioned inventory count
Yep.
requires like has role admin, right?
Mm.
And so maybe maybe with these new primitives you'll be able to produce these. What should I show? Well, you have a dynamic object that only has a few things, and
Yep.
if the value is present, show the menu. If it's not present, don't.
That's really interesting because I've been doing a lot of presentations and working with customers on GraphQL, and that's one of the things that comes up. Like, hey, we have this like fine grained control over fields, but how do I do that with like different roles and when they're logged in, right? So that'd be a really good use case for that. So I'm interested to jump into that. Okay, one more question here, and then we'll move on. When we are using OAuth 2, why can we not see the security logs, the flow of OAuth 2? Is it for not exposing credentials in the logs? So like, hmm,
That's interesting. So you can. I think there are some logs in the OAuth 2 filters. If you set the log levels to trace, you can do something.
best place to start.
But the problem is with OAuth 2 is that it's a multi-system interaction, basically. So your app typically is the client. It's the app that obtains tokens on behalf of the user.
Mm-hmm.
It talks to an authorization server. The user also talks to the authorization server, and you're kind of
Yep.
not really seeing that bit.
Yep.
And then the tokens are sent to a resource server.
Right.
So if you do this, you kind of have to correlate requests.
Yep.
Oh, the user was sent there with these properties, and they came back. So we did a redirect link, and so and we don't have control over, say Keycloak, your company Keycloak, or your company Azure AD or
Right.
Entra ID now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we'd be missing some of these. There is some instrumentation that tells you, oh, I got a
Yep.
token, etc. The thing is, I don't think we logged the tokens. I have to double check to be 100% sure, but these are credentials basically, and
Yeah.
so we don't want that to be in the logs because someone could take it and then try and replay it against the system.
Right.
And so there is a little bit of security consideration in logging too much.
Yep. And it's not like you said, it's not a straight line. That's why they call it the OAuth2 dance, right? We're going back and forth here.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to continue on with this. I see we have a couple other questions we'll get to in a second. I just want to finish up with your talk here. This session aims to provide a useful method for understanding Spring Security's architecture and how to customize it. Through some theory, diagrams, and practice live coding, you will get familiar with the general architecture, foundational patterns, and common abstractions. No more foregoing Stack Overflow in despair. So one of the things I really appreciate about your presentations is you do not shy away from live coding, and you're really good at live coding. A lot of people I see live coding, including myself, can do it, but it almost seems like you're more comfortable than most people doing that. Do you practice it a lot?
Oh yeah.
What's the key here?
I mean, you gave the secret away. It's practice, right? And people
Yeah.
come to me and they're like, "Wow, that was really good," and say, "Yeah, I practiced the session 15 times, including
Right.
twice yesterday, and like
Wow.
once the day before, and once the day
Yeah.
before, until it's like burned into my brain."
Yep.
Some our good friend Josh, says, he practices the live coding until he can do it blindfolded, basically.
Yeah.
So with practice is super important
Yep.
because you will fail in your live coding, and
Yep.
it will blow up. Sometimes
Yep.
it will not work. But if you've practiced enough, you will have seen that bug.
Yeah.
And
I've
so
come
you'll know.
across that too. Yep.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's
You'll
like,
know how to
hey,
fix
I know
something.
what's going to happen when something goes wrong.
Right.
It may not be that exact thing, but I've seen some kind of form of that before, and I know how to react to it. So
There's that, and then there's, I think, one thing that helped me a lot in my practice in this live coding is, I joined Broadcom VMware Pivotal through Pivotal Labs, which was the
Yep.
consulting side of the business,
Mhm.
and there we did pair programming, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week,
Wow.
save for like 2 or 3 meetings a week. But we did like 35 hours of pair programming. So 2 monitors, 2 keyboards, 2 mice, and then 1 computer. So if I type while the other person is typing, she will get my characters on the screen,
Yeah.
and it will be very disruptive.
Yeah.
And so when you're doing this, you can't be quiet because like
Mhm.
it's just like, the goal is to collaborate live, to do like the live, PR review.
Yep.
And so when you do this, you kind of have to learn the skill of, train of thought, you know flow of consciousness that
Yep.
you just, you let go while you're typing.
Yep.
And I think it shows a lot into my live coding practice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely it does. And one of the other things I think that is a part of that is you clearly know your IDE. You're really good in IntelliJ. And I think just seeing you using some of these keyboard shortcuts and all the features of the IDE, how do you get better at that? Because that's one thing, like I try to remind myself every couple of months, like find a new feature and learn that. and kind of put that into your tool belt. But man, you seem to be a wizard in IntelliJ, so I think that helps with live coding.
Yeah, I think, well, it started with the pairing practice in
Yeah.
labs, right? So we paired with customers, and customers were not necessarily super familiar with the IDE, but when you paired with someone who had been at labs for more than a year,
Mhm.
there was this tribal knowledge. And since we switched pairs, we pair with someone new on the team every day, and then
Yep.
every 3 months we switched teams. Like, we would learn from each other by seeing what's happening, right? And then we put
Yep.
the presenter mode, no, not the presenter
Yes.
mode, but like the thing that shows the shortcuts.
Yep. Which is built
Um,
into the IDE now. That's
yeah,
great. So you can
yeah,
just kind
yeah.
of check a checkbox and have that on. So
And so that's by pairing. But
yep.
if you want to learn it yourself from scratch, so first you got to find the good content on the internet, and some,
Yep.
JetBrains, they have developer advocates that showcase this kind of stuff, so you
Yes.
can go and like see the tips and tricks. Don't try
Yep.
to learn everything at once,
That's the
right?
thing, because it's
Yeah,
overwhelming. There's so many, like there are hours and hours of tips and tricks videos, and it's just like I'm not
exactly.
going to learn all this at one time.
And then you try and practice this one thing, being familiar with the command palette. So you do
Yes.
shift or command shift A on Mac or whatever.
Yep.
When you type what you want to do instead of trying to go clicking. And then when you type,
Hmm.
it will show you a list of actions. And then usually there are the shortcuts in there.
Right.
So what I do is, like, I type, and if there's a shortcut, I close the palette and then try and do it with the
Do
shortcut.
it. Yep. Yeah, and that way you kind of, if you just kind of keep doing that over and over again, that repetition, then it becomes kind of second nature. One of the cool shortcuts I learned just a few weeks ago when I did a presentation for JetBrains is I used to, like, when I'd go present on stage, I'd go into my settings and I would like change the font of like the left-hand side. And then I'd change like the editor font to like be a bigger font so everybody could see it. And now I do shift, type in zoom,
Right.
and you can change the zoom level, which kind of zooms everything in for the presenter, which I thought was like, that was awesome, because I hated fumbling through that. So,
Yeah.
and I don't know about you, but I, a lot of the times when I'm watching like somebody else, like you teach on YouTube, I may not be learning everything you're teaching, but I may pick up on one thing, and maybe that was a shortcut in IntelliJ. And if I could pick up that like one thing out of that video, my hour has been a success. So I
Yeah.
pick up a lot of tips and tricks from other presenters.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And then, if you want to go really hardcore, I had this coworker. So he would do usually like half days when he was pairing, so it wasn't too painful for everyone.
Yep.
But like, oh, let's get good at navigation, and so he would like disconnect the mouse, and
Oh,
then
geez.
we'd fumble until you just got better at it.
Yeah, that's crazy. That would be, yeah, that would be hard.
It
But
is
yeah,
painful at first, but then
yeah,
you get used to it.
probably sort of similar to being inside of Vim.
Absolutely the same mindset. But then you get into this idea of like, there's a shortcut for this. Like, there's
Yeah,
this action that I do a lot,
yeah,
and like, these people, they've been writing IDEs for decades.
yeah.
They know the pain, and so they
Right,
probably have a way to do this. And so,
right.
when you find yourself clicking too much, or like, copy pasting a lot, then well, I'm spending time doing this. It's unlikely that there's nothing to make my life easier. And so you can go and forage for your own pains rather than going
Yep,
from, oh, I saw that and then I want to reproduce it.
yep.
You say, oh, I have this problem. Like, I need to format a code block all the time. Like, I put some tags around it. Oh, I can type them at the top and the bottom of the block, but there's probably a way to do that automatically. And yeah,
Right,
of
right.
course there is.
There is, yeah. I use live templates all the time,
Right,
especially in like presentations, just so I can spit out some code. And
right,
I found myself even using that, like not in presentations. Like I want to get a logger for a class. I don't type that at private static
right.
final logger anymore. I just type out a live template. So somebody
One of
mentioned it in the comments, or have a talk with Trisha G.
Yeah.
I agree. I just grabbed this off my bookshelf. This is Getting to Know IntelliJ Idea by Trisha Gee and Helene Scott. So definitely a book you want to get in. But again, this is a pretty thick book for for learning an IDE. That it tells you like how powerful this IDE is. So, and I always tell everybody, you know, I use IntelliJ, but please use whatever text editor, command line, IDE, whatever you're most productive in is the best tool for the job. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
cool. To kind of wrap up your presentation at Spring IO, do you know what day you're on yet? Do we have schedules out yet? I don't
think the
so.
schedule is
No.
out, but I'll be there for the whole 2 days.
All right. So you'll be there talking Spring Security. This is your only talk?
Yes, it is.
All right. So the next best presentation is the hallway track. So make sure you grab Daniel in the hallway and talk his ears off about Spring Security, because I know you love talking about this stuff.
Oh yeah, I was in Java land about a month ago in Germany,
Nice.
and so after I did a similar presentation, but it was an hour and a half, and so I discussed with attendees after the fact, and then one of them had very specific questions around LDAP. So like, oh, I want LDAP and I want blah blah blah. And I was like, you know what? Let's go sit down in the hallway
That's
and
awesome.
find a table and then code it together. And we coded a small sample, and then he got away with, he went away back to his company with a sample of, okay, here are the entry points you need to know about, because in the session I tried to give you the entry points, tried to give you the keys to finding more by yourself. But you still have to do the hard work of understanding the underlying security protocols and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're not super familiar with LDAP, I have more experience with it, so I can guide you towards configuring Spring Security for using LDAP in its most basic form and achieving what you want to. You want to be using this class here. But if I just tell you this class, you're going to fumble a lot until you understand how it fits in there. But I can give you a small repo with Docker Compose, and then you have something to play with immediately.
Right. Okay. Before we get in, we're going to talk about what's new in Spring Security 6.3. I have a couple of other questions. Do you foresee more automatic rewrite recipes being provided to help overcome some of the replacement from 5 to 6 in open source projects, or do you think this is too individualized?
So I'm not sure about that, but I don't think it's in our roadmap to try and do that. There is, surprisingly, there is very good documentation around migrating from 5 to 6.
Mm-hmm.
We've introduced a version just for the migration, so 5.8 has never been shipped with Spring Boot, but it's compatible with the 2.7 line, right? And so if you're planning to migrate to 6, what we recommend is you go to your Spring Boot 2.7, and then you change Spring Security to 5.8 instead of 5.7, and then you go on the documentation of 5.8, and then you'll have something that's called, I think it's called migrate or preparing for 6.0. And there you can turn on all the things that will be default in 6.0.
Wow.
And your app is still compiling against an old Spring Boot. And then from there,
that's awesome.
Right. And then from there, when you move, all these values that you set, so you need to set this value to enable new behavior. When you go to 6.0, you just remove the feature flags, if you will, that you turned on, and then you get the default behavior.
Wow, that's so cool. Yeah, and I know there are some recipes out there. Even the migrating from like 2.7x to 3.0, that has, I think, a Spring Security rewrite rule in there. So you could always, that's open source. You could always take a look at that, and if you need to adjust it, you can. I also know we have a bit of a commercial project at Broadcom going on. I don't want to mess the name up, so I'm not going to say it. But that will include a lot of more professional rewrite recipes written by the Spring team. So that's something to look out for.
So it's the Spring App Advisor.
App Advisor. I was going to say accelerator, but that's why I didn't say it. Okay, one more question here. Does Spring Security have something related to rate limit configuration?
No.
No, but you can get that in Spring Cloud. So Spring Cloud, MVC, Spring Cloud, the WebFlux version, you can do kind of rate limiting at that level, and that's probably where you want to do it, right?
Yeah, you could do
So
and you could do a gateway in front of your your services because you want to maybe manage your rate limit across a domain or across multiple
yep,
microservices, and
yep,
it's not a security constraint.
right,
It's kind of a non-functional requirement that's not
right,
close. It's tied to security because we want to know who you are, so you can
yep,
rate limit one specific entity or user and not everyone across the
yep.
application. But it's more downstream of Spring Security.
Yep. And those are cross-cutting concerns, which are perfect for a gateway, right? Like I can have security, I can have my rate limiting, I can have like observability, all of that kind of lives at the gateway and you push down to downstream services. Okay, let me go ahead and pop this back on screen and we'll talk about what's new in Spring Security 6.3. So I'm looking at the documentation. Is there anything you want to specifically highlight first?
So the authorization bit, the one you're scrolling over now.
All right.
So there's two main things uh, that we want to provide. One is what we mentioned earlier, which is secure return values. So in your objects that are returned from anything that Spring proxies, so basically a repository,
Yep.
um, or any component. Basically, these objects you can annotate fields or methods and say, you know, has has role, blah blah blah, has authority, blah blah blah,
Mhm.
um, and this is done. This is the same as what we had in method security.
Yep.
So we had at pre-authorize and at post-authorize. And so you can annotate fields now with pre-authorize or post-authorize, and it will surface some things and not the others. Set the rest to null by default. Um, and so in order to make this experience customizable and enjoyable by end users, we we allow you to write your own annotations. So
Nice.
now you'll be able to say like at is librarian for handling the books, or has how's it called that in the paranoia game, has a accreditation level purple.
Oh yeah.
And so you don't have to write a whole thing that has a string inside. You just have this annotation. So we make the things that allow you to put a specific annotation on these fields that you can reuse. And then we have more annotations for specific error handling. So what happens if a user doesn't have the permissions to see this? Do you do you throw an exception? Do you put a default value? Do you put a null? And so that's the big authorization chunk. Then there are two things that I think are worth mentioning. One is the connection to compromised password checking.
Hmm.
So the with there's a service online that's called Have I Been Pwned? I owned PWNED. I don't know how you pronounce that.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's basically, you can go on that haveibeenpwned.com, and then if you type a password or an email, it will
Oh,
tell you this has been leaked.
gotcha.
And so the guy who runs this is Troy Hunt. He's an independent person, I think, works with Microsoft. I'm not sure. And so he runs this, and he provides an API for basically like making a REST request in a secure way to check if a password has been compromised or not.
Okay.
And this is already in your password manager. If you use 1Password, I think
Yep.
it's in there. Right? You type a password and it tells you, no, this is just too
Probably
insecure.
shouldn't use
It's
this.
leaked
Yeah.
everywhere. People are going to do credential stuffing, so don't use that. So we have
Yep.
this. And then the last bit that may be interesting is the OAuth 2 work. So there's OAuth 2 in the client side. So in Spring Security itself, we have the client implementation for OAuth 2 token exchange, which allows so in OAuth 2 you get access tokens basically, and these access tokens, your app gets an access token from Microsoft, say, and then this access token can then be sent to microservices, for example. And so the microservice can say, oh, yes, this user has permissions to delete photos.
Mhm.
But then if your client is talking to a lot of services, you may need a lot of permissions or a lot of different tokens, and you don't
Right.
want the user to go through multiple flows to obtain different tokens. And so what you will do with this token exchange is that your client gets a token with maybe a lot of permissions in them, and you don't want to send them to multiple services because you want, least privilege.
Mhm.
And so now we implement a way for you to take this token and then exchange it for on the client, so the user doesn't see that. Exchange it for another token, so maybe a
Wow.
token with less scopes, a
Yep.
token or a different type of token. So there's that in Spring Security in the client side, and it's also in Spring Authorization Server. So in
Oh,
Spring
nice.
Authorization Server, we implement this new OAuth2 token exchange grant. In Spring Authorization Server as well, so it's not in the security release notes. We have two other things. Client authentication with TLS instead of using, a password, a client secret, for example. And then
Yep.
the last bit we have is we're working on multi-tenancy, so that
Nice.
one authorization server can have multiple key cloak realms, if you will.
Awesome. Cool. And Spring Security 6.3.3, is this out yet, or
No,
is
so
this
we're at RC1,
that's
RC2,
what I think I was just seeing.
right?
So right now this is a snapshot. Okay.
Yeah, but we're in RC now, and we'll be releasing before Spring Boot 3.3, so
Okay.
before
Cool.
the end of the month, right? It
Couple
goes
weeks.
a
Yeah.
bit earlier in the release train.
Awesome. So when we pick up Spring Boot 3.3, that will come with Spring Security 6.3.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Let me go ahead and see if we have any more questions here. We're coming up on the hour, but I think I have one. Why is the security config with the UI much harder, or do I lack things? So there's
So
the security configuration that you normally put into place. Is there a what is the UI? What is he saying there?
I'm not
Either or not.
100% sure, but yeah, the security config, as we mentioned, is kind of a bit difficult to understand at first until
Yep.
you get, the keys. Watch the
The,
replay of
the
my
foundations.
session. Get the foundations, so you can understand. Okay, this security config, it has these methods, and the method configure one aspect of security: how you log in with OAuth, how you authorize requests, how you do, CSRF protection,
Mhm.
um, and then you can configure a subset of these features. And usually you configure them by, adding or changing a filter. So what happens when, for example, the credentials check fails? Do I
Yeah.
want it 403? Do I want to redirect? Oh,
Right.
Angular Vue.js. Oh, yeah, yeah, right. Okay, so the question is completely different. um,
But
so
still pretty much the same. I mean,
yeah,
trying to configure something, right?
so we're trying to configure a Spring app to work with a single page app front end, so
Yep.
Angular, Vue, React. Um, so it doesn't have to be that hard,
Right.
um,
Right.
but there's a great talk by a colleague, Marcus Hertz da Corregio. He did at Spring IO last year, 2 years ago, something like that, about securing single page apps. And
Nice.
I know they're working with Josh Cummings from the security team for a more up to date version of that. The reason why it's complicated is because you have two apps running, and so you kind of have to decide on a protocol for securing these two things.
Yep.
And each of these front ends has their own idea of what secure means and how to configure it. And so
Yep.
Spring Security can't support everything out of the box.
Yeah.
What we recommend, if you can do it, is just like use a gateway pattern or serve your front end from something that is Spring Security enabled. And so your front end will only have a session. The only security you need is having a session with the backend that uses Spring Security, for example, a gateway. And so don't try and handle your security in the front end if you can avoid it, right? So either you have a valid session, and when you make requests, you get 200s, or if you don't have a session, you'll get 401s or 403s. And that's the simplest. If you need more advanced stuff, then it needs a little bit of work to align these two worlds and have them work in concert.
Yep. And I think one of the changes you mentioned earlier, specifically with Spring Security 6, is we moved away from the web security configure adapter into more of a componentized model. You don't need these long classes with configurations in them anymore. You can kind of break those into logical chunks. So make sure if you're on like kind of the newest version of Spring Security, you can take advantage of that.
Yeah, we do it in the commercial component that I use. We have this SSO model, and it's a federated identity provider, which delegates to some upstream providers, and it supports OpenID. It supports local user database for testing. It supports LDAP, and has experimental support for SAML. And so all of these are implemented through custom configurers that are loaded into your filter chain.
Yep.
When the adequate configuration is present.
Yep. Cool.
It's pretty cool, but it's advanced.
It is. Okay, cool. I think we're running up against to it. I am going to be in Barcelona for Spring IO. I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in the meeting the real Daniel, because we've only talked online for 2 years. We keep missing each other at all these different conferences. So
I think we bumped into each other at Spring One last year, but it was so busy that.
Oh yeah, we did. You're right. I got in on like a Saturday night at 2 a.m. Sunday we had rehearsals for main stage 1. Monday was all day Spring One. I had 3 talks there. Yeah, that was there was a lot going on there. But this time we're gonna get to hang out. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm very much looking forward to attending your talk. Hopefully they don't put us at the same time, or I'll have to have a talk with Sergey. But yeah, looking forward to that. So if you're going to be at Spring IO, make sure you go check out Daniel's talk, Spring Security Architecture. What is the title again? Principles. Sorry. So yeah, looking forward to that. I really appreciate you taking some time today to hang out with me. It's been, like you said, it's been a little while since we had to chat. Yeah. And this was a lot of fun. Where can people find out more about you after we get off the show today?
So if you've seen my name, Daniel Garnier-Moiroux, there's exactly one of me on the planet that I know for sure. And so, you'll find my LinkedIn, my website, my Twitter, my Mastodon, whatever you want. Easiest is probably to go through my website, which is Garnier, like the shampoos, Garnier.wf. And then you'll have links to everything there. And of course, if you're at Spring IO, just like come and talk to me. I am happy missing talks. I will rewatch them. I will watch them. I'll watch the replays, that's for sure.
Yep.
But I'd rather miss the talk, have an interesting conversation, and do a replay after. So Don't hesitate. It'll be fun.
Cool. I'll get all those links in the show notes, and I will give you another plug. Daniel has some great presentations on YouTube. The workshops that you have done on Spring Security that are 3 and 4 and 5 hours long, I find just the level of depth that you go into on some of these, on like how Spring Security works, just kind of finally made some of that click for me. So definitely go check those out if you can find them on YouTube. All right, with that, Daniel, it's been a lot of fun. We will do this again next week, probably more at the 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we have another interesting guest that I will go ahead and get put up there later this week. So with that, Daniel, thanks again. We'll see everyone.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun, and see you in Spring IO.
Yes.